They say the West shows a man who he really is the moment no one else is watching. The wind moved slow across the dry hills outside Red Hollow, carrying dust the color of rust and the quiet creak of saddle leather. Late afternoon sunlight stretched long across the prairie, turning every fence post and mesquite shadow into thin black lines across the ground. A lone cottonwood stood beside the narrow trail, its branches bending gently with the wind, and beneath it a young native girl stood with a rope looped loosely above her head, tied to a branch not far above reach. It looked less like punishment and more like a message left for the desert to read. Her hands were free, her posture straight, her dark eyes steady, fixed somewhere far beyond the empty horizon as if she had already decided what came next. 50 yards away, hidden behind the slow rise of a sandstone ridge, a man on horseback watched the scene without moving. Ethan Cole had been riding that trail for nearly 10 miles without expecting to see another soul. His bay horse shifted quietly beneath him, snorting once as the wind brushed through its mane. Ethan rested one hand on the saddle horn, the other hanging loosely near his thigh, not reaching for anything, not rushing anything. In the West, rushing usually meant misunderstanding the moment. The girl didn't look frightened. She didn't call for help. She simply waited. Ethan studied the ground around the cottonwood. Boot tracks. Several horses. Fresh dust still drifting where hooves had passed less than an hour before. Whoever had arranged that strange little scene wanted someone to see it. Wanted someone to stop. Wanted someone curious enough to step closer. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. Well now, he muttered softly to the horse, his voice low and calm like a man speaking more to the wind than to himself. The girl finally noticed him when the horse took 2 slow steps forward. Her eyes moved, sharp and steady, measuring him in the same silent way he had been measuring her. For a moment neither spoke. The plains around them seemed to pause with the wind. Ethan tipped the brim of his hat slightly, not as greeting, but as acknowledgement. "Looks like someone left you here to make a point," he said quietly. The girl studied him, then the trail behind him, then the empty ridge lines stretching for miles. When she spoke, her voice carried calm strength that didn't belong to someone standing beneath a rope. "They are not far," she said. Ethan nodded once as if that confirmed something he already suspected. His eyes moved again across the open land, toward the distant canyon walls glowing red in the falling sun. Somewhere out there, riders were circling back, waiting to see who would take the bait. Ethan slid one boot from the stirrup and stepped down slowly into the dust. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of distant hoofbeats rolling like thunder across the far valley. He reached up calmly, lifted the rope from the branch, and let it fall harmlessly into the dirt. The girl watched him carefully. "You should leave," she said. Ethan dusted his hands once against his coat and glanced toward the wide, open trail. "Funny thing about trouble," he replied quietly. "Sometimes it follows you. Sometimes it waits for you. And sometimes," he looked out across the empty land where the dust clouds were beginning to rise, "sometimes it sends an invitation." Ethan Cole stood for a moment beside the cottonwood tree, the loose rope resting in the dust near his boots as the wind carried the faint rhythm of approaching horses across the valley floor. The sound was distant but steady, like thunder that had not yet decided whether it would become a storm. His bay horse shifted behind him, ears turning toward the canyon, as if the animal understood the language of hoofbeats better than any man ever could. The girl remained exactly where she was, watching him with the same calm eyes that had met him moments earlier, eyes that carried neither panic nor relief, only awareness. Ethan brushed a thin layer of red dust from his coat sleeve and glanced toward the horizon where the sun hung low above the western hills. "You said they are not far," he said quietly. "That was not a warning. That was certainty." The girl nodded once. "They left me here so someone like you would stop." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Someone like me." He repeated the words as if weighing them in the air. "That suggests they know the kind of rider who travels this trail." The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him more closely now. "They know the kind of rider who cannot ignore what he sees." Ethan looked back toward the trail that stretched empty for miles, a ribbon of pale dust cutting through dry grass and scattered stones. The wind moved through the prairie in slow waves, bending the tall grass like water rolling across a lake. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked calmly back to his horse and loosened the reins, giving the animal room to breathe. The distant hoofbeats were clearer now, perhaps half a mile away, echoing faintly between the canyon walls. Whoever was riding toward them had no reason to hurry. That told Ethan more than speed ever could. Riders who expected trouble rode fast. Riders who believed they controlled the moment rode slow. He stepped back beside the girl and looked up at the cottonwood branch where the rope had been tied. "You could have untied yourself," he said. "Your hands were free." "Yes," she answered softly. "But then they would know I was not afraid." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "And that matters. It matters to men who believe fear is power." The wind shifted again, carrying with it the smell of horse sweat and leather from the approaching riders. Ethan could see the dust now rising beyond the ridge, a pale cloud drifting slowly upward in the evening light. He reached down and picked up the rope from the ground, coiling it loosely in his hands before tossing it across the saddle horn. The girl watched him with quiet curiosity. "You should ride," she said. "This was never meant to be your fight." Ethan rested his forearms on the saddle and looked toward the canyon where the riders would soon appear. "That is the thing about fights out here," he replied calmly. "Sometimes they belong to whoever refuses to walk away." The girl studied his face for a long moment before speaking again. "If you stay, they will believe the trap worked." Ethan placed his hat more firmly on his head and swung into the saddle with an easy motion that came from years on the trail. He turned the horse slightly, so it faced the open path where the riders would emerge. "Maybe it did," he said quietly. "Just not the way they planned." The girl stepped beside the horse, her eyes now fixed on the rising dust cloud approaching through the red glow of sunset. "You do not know who they are." Ethan watched the horizon with the still patience of a man who had learned long ago that the land always revealed its answers in time. "Out here," he said slowly, "men who set traps usually tell you everything you need to know the moment they think they have already won." The riders appeared slowly over the ridge just as the last light of the sun spread across the valley floor, their silhouettes cutting through the red dust like shadows drifting across a painted sky. Ethan Cole watched without moving, his horse standing calm beneath him, the animal breathing slow and steady as if it understood that the next few minutes would decide everything. There were 6 of them, riding in a loose line that showed confidence more than caution. Their horses walked at an easy pace, hooves pressing soft prints into the dry trail as the wind carried the faint creak of saddle leather and the quiet jingle of metal buckles. The girl beside the cottonwood followed the same dust cloud with her eyes, but she did not step back or try to hide. Instead, she folded her hands calmly in front of her, standing tall in the fading light, as if the open prairie itself had taught her patience. Ethan tipped his head slightly toward her. "Friends of yours," he said quietly. She shook her head once. "They believe they own the road." Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. Men who believe they own something usually spend a great deal of time proving it. The riders reached the bottom of the ridge and spread slightly across the trail, their leader guiding a tall gray horse to the front while the others fanned out behind him like a curtain closing around the scene. The man wore a long dark coat despite the lingering heat of the day, and his hat sat low over sharp eyes that moved quickly between Ethan and the girl. The moment he recognized the empty rope lying in the dirt, his mouth curved into a thin smile that carried more calculation than surprise. "Well now," the rider called out across the distance, his voice calm and almost friendly. "Looks like our little message worked." Ethan rested his forearms across the saddle horn, showing no sign of tension as the horses came closer. "Depends on what kind of message you were sending," he replied. The man on the gray horse slowed to a stop about 20 yards away, studying Ethan carefully, as if searching his memory for a name he might have heard before. The other riders remained quiet behind him, watching with the patient stillness of men who believe the moment already belonged to them. The leader's gaze shifted toward the girl. "You were told to wait," he said evenly. The girl answered without lowering her eyes. "I did." His smile returned, thin and thoughtful. "And you found company." Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat slightly against the low sun. "The road has a habit of bringing strangers together." The man on the gray horse studied him another long moment, then looked down at the rope on the ground before glancing back toward the canyon trail behind him. The wind moved softly through the grass again, carrying the smell of dust and sage across the valley. "You must be a curious man," the rider said, stopping for something that was never meant for you. Ethan glanced briefly toward the cottonwood tree and then back to the line of riders. Curiosity keeps a man awake out here, he replied calmly. The leader chuckled quietly, the sound carrying across the still air. Or it gets him lost. His eyes moved again to the girl. You should have told him what you were carrying. Ethan noticed the smallest shift in the girl's posture, a subtle tightening of her shoulders that lasted less than a heartbeat. It was enough. Something small. Something important. Something worth setting a trap on an empty trail miles from the nearest town. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the small leather pouch hanging at the girl's belt, its worn surface catching the last line of sunlight as the wind lifted the edge of her coat. The leader of the riders noticed Ethan's glance and smiled wider now, satisfied that the moment had revealed exactly what he wanted it to reveal. That, he said softly, nodding toward the pouch, does not belong to her. Ethan looked back at the man on the gray horse, his expression unchanged as the evening wind swept across the prairie. Funny thing about belonging, he said quietly. Out here, the land decides that better than men do. The wind rolled quietly across the open valley as the last light of the sun slipped behind the canyon walls, turning the dust in the air a deep copper color. Ethan Cole remained still in the saddle, his eyes resting on the man riding the gray horse while the other riders watched from behind, like shadows waiting for direction. The prairie had gone quiet in the way it sometimes did at the end of a long day, when even the birds seemed to pause and listen to what men might decide next. The man on the gray horse tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan as though measuring a piece of land he might someday claim. You must be new to this part of the territory, he said with calm patience. Otherwise you would know when a road does not belong to you. Ethan rested one boot loosely in the stirrup and let his horse take a slow step forward, no more than 2 feet through the dust. Road looks wide enough, he answered. Seems like it was meant for anyone willing to ride it. A faint chuckle moved through the riders behind the gray horse, but their leader did not laugh. His eyes had moved again to the leather pouch hanging at the girl's belt. The wind lifted the edge of the girl's coat once more, revealing the worn stitching along the pouch and the small turquoise bead tied to its cord. The leader pointed toward it without raising his voice. That pouch carries something that was misplaced, he said. We are simply here to collect it. Ethan glanced toward the girl for the briefest moment. Her expression had not changed, but the way her hand rested near the pouch told him everything he needed to know. Whatever was inside that small piece of leather had brought 6 men across miles of empty land and convinced them to set a trap on a forgotten trail. Ethan returned his attention to the rider on the gray horse. Misplaced things usually get returned in town, he said calmly. Sheriff tends to like that sort of conversation. The leader smiled again, though the smile carried a thin edge now. Sheriffs care about cattle and fences, he replied. Not about something like this. His eyes shifted briefly toward the girl again. You have caused a great deal of trouble by carrying it. The girl finally spoke, her voice steady in the quiet air. It was never yours. The riders behind the leader shifted slightly in their saddles, but the man on the gray horse only leaned back a little, as though the words amused him. Ownership is a flexible idea out here, he said slowly, especially when a thing is found far from the people who understand its value. Ethan studied the man carefully now. There was confidence in the way he spoke, but not the reckless kind that came from anger. This was the confidence of someone who believed the land itself would eventually bend to his plans. Ethan had seen that look before in men who spent more time thinking about what the future could give them than about what the present might take away. The evening wind moved across the valley again, carrying the distant scent of dry sage and cooling earth. Ethan looked out across the empty prairie behind the riders, the fading lights stretching long shadows toward the cottonwood tree. You rode a long way for something small enough to fit in a pouch, he said. The leader nodded slightly. Some small things change entire valleys. Ethan let those words hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. Silver. The leader's smile grew wider, and for the first time a faint spark of excitement appeared in his eyes. Not silver, he said. Something better. Ethan watched him closely. A map. The leader did not answer, but the silence that followed was answer enough. The wind stirred the girl's dark hair across her shoulder as she stood beside Ethan's horse. The riders remained still, the fading sun now dropping below the ridge and leaving the valley washed in deep blue twilight. Ethan finally leaned forward slightly in the saddle and looked down at the pouch again before lifting his eyes back to the man on the gray horse. "Funny thing about maps," he said quietly. "They do not belong to the man who steals them." The last light of the sun faded behind the western ridge, leaving the valley wrapped in the quiet blue glow that always arrived just before night settled over the desert. The riders remained where they were, their horses shifting slowly in the cooling air while the wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush across the open land. Ethan Cole did not rush to speak. Again, out on the frontier, silence often revealed more truth than words. The man on the gray horse studied Ethan carefully, the confident smile on his face slowly returning, as if the conversation had finally reached the point he had been waiting for all along. "You are sharper than most travelers who pass through here," the rider said calmly. "Yes, a map." His eyes drifted once more toward the pouch hanging at the girl's belt. "And not just any map. One that shows where the mountains hide something men have been searching for longer than you have been riding these trails." The wind lifted a small swirl of dust between them, drifting lazily across the fading light. Ethan leaned slightly in the saddle and rested his hands over the saddle horn as if the entire matter were nothing more than a quiet conversation between strangers on a lonely road. "If a map like that exists," he said slowly, "I imagine a great many people would want to see it." The leader nodded. "Exactly." His gaze moved toward the distant canyon, where the dark line of rocks stretched for miles across the horizon like the spine of some ancient creature sleeping beneath the earth. "That map leads to a silver vein deep in the Redstone Hills. A place most men would ride past without ever knowing what lies beneath their horses' hooves." The riders behind him exchanged quiet looks, but remained silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the weight of the conversation, their breathing slow and steady in the gathering dusk. The girl finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "The map does not belong to you." The leader tilted his head slightly, as though the words amused him more than offended him. "Perhaps not," he replied. "But whoever holds it controls the future of every mile of land between here and the river valley." Ethan watched the man carefully now, studying the quiet ambition hidden beneath the smooth tone of his voice. He had seen men chase fortunes before. Some chased gold, others chased cattle. But there was a particular look in the eyes of a man who believed he had discovered something that could change the shape of an entire territory. Ethan shifted his weight slightly in the saddle and glanced toward the canyon walls glowing faintly under the rising moon. "Silver brings towns," he said quietly. "Towns bring railroads. Railroads bring men who write laws on paper." The leader's smile widened. "Now you understand." He gestured toward the girl's pouch again. "That little map is worth more than every horse standing on this road tonight." The prairie wind moved softly across the valley once more, brushing against the cottonwood leaves with a faint whisper. Ethan looked down at the leather pouch for a moment before lifting his eyes back toward the riders. "And you believe she will simply hand it over?" The man on the gray horse shrugged lightly. Eventually, his gaze shifted toward the open plains behind Ethan. Every traveler reaches a moment when the road ahead looks more dangerous than the one behind. Ethan followed the direction of his glance for a brief second before returning his attention to the rider. The valley had grown darker now, the stars beginning to appear one by one above the canyon rim. He noticed the girl standing quietly beside his horse, her eyes fixed on the leader as if measuring the distance between what he believed and what he truly understood. Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle and spoke in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning of the conversation. "There is one problem with that plan." The leader raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" Ethan rested his hand lightly against the saddle horn and looked out across the silent valley. "You assumed the trap would catch the kind of man who gives up easily." The valley had grown quiet in the way wide-open places often do once night begins to settle over the land. A pale moon climbed slowly above the Redstone Hills, casting silver light across the prairie grass and the dusty trail where the riders remained facing one another. Ethan Cole sat steady in the saddle, the calm posture of a man who had spent most of his life on long roads where patience mattered more than speed. The leader on the gray horse studied him closely after hearing his last words, the thin smile on his face fading just slightly as if he had realized the conversation had turned onto unfamiliar ground. The other riders shifted in their saddles behind him, their horses stamping softly against the hard earth while the wind brushed through the cottonwood leaves nearby. "You speak with a great deal of confidence. For a man surrounded on an empty road," the leader said at last. Ethan looked slowly across the line of riders, and then toward the open valley beyond them, where the moonlight stretched across miles of quiet land. "Confidence has very little to do with it," he replied calmly. "It is more about understanding how men behave when they believe they already won." The leader narrowed his eyes slightly. "And what is that supposed to mean?" Ethan rested his hands loosely on the saddle horn while his horse lowered its head to breathe the cool air. "It means you have been watching this trail all evening waiting for someone to stop. But you did not expect that someone to stay." The wind drifted across the prairie again, carrying the distant call of a night bird from somewhere deep in the canyon. The girl remained beside Ethan's horse, silent but attentive, her dark eyes moving between the riders as if studying every movement they made. The leader on the gray horse glanced briefly toward the hills behind him before returning his gaze to Ethan. "You think staying changes anything?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes it changes everything." He lifted his eyes toward the dark outline of the Redstone Hills rising against the star-filled sky. "You spoke about a silver vein hidden in those mountains. A place worth more than every ranch between here and the river valley." The leader watched him carefully now, no longer smiling. Ethan continued in the same quiet voice. "Men who find something that valuable rarely travel alone." The riders behind the leader shifted again, their earlier confidence fading into something more uncertain. The leader spoke slowly now. "What are you suggesting?" Ethan tilted his head toward the canyon walls where faint lights flickered far in the distance like small stars resting along the horizon. "I am suggesting that the hills have more eyes watching them tonight than just yours." The girl followed his gaze and noticed the same distant glimmers of light scattered along the high ridges overlooking the valley. Riders, quiet silhouettes standing against the moonlit sky. The leader of the gang turned sharply in the saddle as he saw them too, his expression tightening as the truth settled in. They had not been the only ones tracking the map. The wind carried the distant echo of hooves moving slowly along the high ground. Ethan looked back at him with calm certainty. "Silver changes territories," he said softly, "which means anyone who knows about that map is already riding toward these hills." The leader glanced once more at the shadowy figures appearing along the ridgeline, the confident control he once carried now replaced by careful calculation. Ethan leaned slightly forward in the saddle, his voice quiet but steady beneath the wide desert sky. "So now the question is not whether you get that map," he said. "The question is how many men are about to come looking for it." The moon climbed higher above the Redstone Hills, spreading pale silver light across the valley as the distant figures along the ridgeline slowly became clearer against the night sky. The wind moved steadily through the prairie grass, carrying the quiet rhythm of hooves from the high ground where several riders now stood watching the scene unfold below. Ethan Cole remained calm in the saddle, his posture unchanged as if the growing tension in the valley were nothing more than another passing desert wind. The leader on the gray horse turned fully in his saddle to study the ridgeline, his earlier confidence replaced by a long silent calculation. The silhouettes above them were still too far away to count clearly, but there were enough to tell a simple truth. The hills were no longer empty. One of the riders behind him spoke quietly. "More men." The leader did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked slowly back toward Ethan and the girl standing beside the horse. The leather pouch at her belt caught the faint glow of moonlight again, its worn surface reflecting just enough light to remind everyone present why they had come to this lonely trail. "You knew they were coming," the leader said at last. Ethan shrugged slightly. "Men chasing silver rarely travel alone." The leader studied him carefully. "You did not ride here by accident." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "Neither did you." The wind shifted again, bringing with it the faint sound of voices echoing down from the ridgeline where the new riders had begun moving slowly along the high ground. They were not rushing. They were positioning themselves. The leader on the gray horse understood what that meant as well as Ethan did. The valley had suddenly become a place where too many men had discovered the same secret. He glanced once, more toward the girl. "You should have hidden better," he said quietly. The girl met his gaze without hesitation. The map was never meant to stay hidden forever. The leader gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. His eyes returned to Ethan. And you believe you can simply ride away with it? Ethan looked out across the moonlit prairie where the trail stretched east toward the river valley and west toward the canyon mouth. No, he said calmly. But I believe something else. The leader raised an eyebrow. Ethan gestured slowly toward the ridgeline where the distant riders were now clearly spreading along the high cliffs. Every man up there believes that map belongs to him. The leader followed the direction of his hand again. The riders on the ridge had begun lighting small lanterns along the high rocks, their flickering glow forming a thin line of moving lights against the dark hills. It was no longer possible to pretend the valley belonged to a single group. The leader turned back to Ethan with a quieter voice. If they come down here, no one walks away with it. Ethan nodded once. That is the trouble with silver. It makes men forget what roads were meant for. The prairie wind carried the distant call of another rider from the hills, followed by the slow echo of hooves beginning their descent along the canyon trail. The leader exhaled slowly and glanced once more at the pouch. For the first time since he arrived, the certainty in his eyes had begun to fade. Ethan watched him carefully and spoke in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning. You set a trap tonight, he said. But you forgot one thing about traps out here. The leader looked up again. Ethan rested his hands on the saddle horn and turned his horse slightly toward the open valley as the distant riders continued their slow descent from the hills. Once the whole territory smells silver, he said quietly. Every trap stops belonging to the man who built it. The lantern lights along the ridgeline continued to move slowly through the darkness as the riders descended the narrow canyon path one by one, their silhouettes growing larger against the moonlit valley. The prairie wind carried the low murmur of distant voices and the steady rhythm of hooves striking stone. Far above the trail, Ethan Cole watched the lights without hurry, the calm posture of a man who had seen enough long nights on the frontier to understand how quickly fortunes could shift beneath an open sky. The leader on the gray horse remained silent for a long moment, his eyes tracking the slow descent of the new riders while the men behind him shifted uneasily in their saddles. What had begun as a carefully arranged trap on an empty road had turned into something else entirely. The valley now held too many eyes, too many riders, and far too much interest in a single worn leather pouch. The leader finally turned back toward Ethan and the girl, his expression thoughtful rather than confident now. How many more know about that map? He asked quietly. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the canyon mouth where the descending lanterns flickered against the rocks like small drifting stars. Enough, he said. Enough that none of us will leave here unnoticed. The wind brushed across the valley again, bending the tall grass and carrying the cool scent of night across the open land. The girl stood beside Ethan's horse, her hand resting lightly against the pouch as though she could feel the weight of every rider now searching for it. The leader studied her carefully. You knew this would happen, he said. She did not deny it. The hills have been whispering about silver for months, she replied calmly. Sooner or later, every man who heard the whisper would come looking. One of the riders behind the leader spoke under his breath. And now they are here. The lanterns along the canyon path had grown brighter, their light reflecting off saddle buckles and rifle barrels as the new group of riders reached the lower slope of the valley. Ethan counted at least 10 shapes moving through the moonlit dust. More than enough to make the night unpredictable. The leader followed Ethan's gaze and let out a slow breath. Too many men chasing the same dream, he murmured. Ethan nodded slightly. Silver does that. For a moment no one moved. The valley seemed to hold its breath as the approaching riders spread slowly across the trail below the ridge, their lanterns casting long shadows over the ground. It was clear now that none of the groups would leave easily while the map remained in sight. The leader on the gray horse looked once more at the pouch and then back toward Ethan. You said earlier that maps do not belong to the man who steals them, he said. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached down and adjusted the reins loosely in his hands, turning his horse slightly so it faced the wide open prairie beyond the cottonwood tree. That is right, he said at last. The leader studied the movement carefully. Then who do you think it belongs to? Ethan looked down briefly toward the girl beside him, then out across the valley where 3 separate groups of riders now watched one another in uneasy silence beneath the rising moon. The wind moved across the grass again, carrying the distant clink of harness and the quiet shuffle of hooves as the men in the valley waited for someone to make the next decision. Ethan spoke softly, his voice steady beneath the wide night sky. "Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do with a map," he said, "is make sure no one ever reaches the place it leads to." The valley had fallen into a deep desert silence beneath the high moon, the kind of stillness that comes when too many men realize the same truth at the same time. Lanterns flickered along the canyon path where the newest riders had stopped their descent, their horses standing restless in the cool night air as they studied the scene below. 3 groups of men now faced one another across the dusty trail, each one aware that the small leather pouch beside Ethan Cole's saddle had become the center of the entire territory's attention. The prairie wind moved softly through the grass and cottonwood leaves, carrying with it the distant creak of saddle leather and the slow breathing of tired horses. Ethan remained calm in the saddle, watching the lantern lights shift along the canyon ridge while the leader on the gray horse studied him with quiet frustration. The trap that had once seemed so simple had dissolved into uncertainty the moment the valley filled with other riders. The leader glanced toward the pouch again, and then back toward the descending group along the ridge. "If you believe no one should reach the place on that map," he said slowly, "then why keep it at all?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly in the saddle and looked down at the girl beside him. The moonlight reflected faintly in her dark eyes as she understood the question without needing to ask it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached slowly to the pouch at her belt and untied the thin leather cord. The small pouch rested in her hand for a moment, its worn surface holding the quiet weight of every man's ambition in the valley. The riders watched in silence. Even the horses seemed to stand more still as the wind passed softly through the open prairie. The girl stepped forward and handed the pouch up toward Ethan. He accepted it calmly and held it in his gloved hands for a moment, feeling the folded paper inside shift slightly beneath the leather. The leader on the gray horse leaned forward in the saddle, his voice tight, with restrained anticipation. "Careful," he said. "You are holding the future of this valley." Ethan looked out across the moonlit land stretching toward the distant hills where silver dreams had already begun to pull men from every corner of the frontier. He had seen places like this before. A quiet valley, a rumor of something buried beneath the ground, and then the long, slow arrival of men who believed fortune waited just beneath the dust. He loosened the leather cord and opened the pouch. Inside was a folded piece of weathered paper marked with careful lines and symbols pointing toward the hidden veins of the Redstone Hills. The lantern light from the ridge glimmered faintly across the map as he unfolded it once. The riders watched with silent attention. The leader's eyes never left the paper. Ethan studied the map for only a few seconds before folding it again. Then he looked up at the men around him. "Every one of you believes this will make you rich," he said quietly. No one answered. The truth had already settled over the valley like the night air. Ethan turned his horse slowly toward the cottonwood tree beside the trail. The riders watched closely as he dismounted and walked the few steps to the base of the tree where the prairie grass moved gently in the wind. Without speaking another word, he placed the folded map back inside the pouch and tied the cord tightly. Then he knelt and pressed the pouch deep into the loose earth beneath the cottonwood roots, covering it with dust and small stones until the ground looked undisturbed beneath the pale moonlight. When he stood again, the valley remained silent. The leader stared at the spot for a long moment before finally speaking. "You buried it." Ethan brushed the dust from his hands and returned to his horse. "No," he replied calmly as he swung into the saddle. "I left it where the land can decide who deserves to find it." The prairie wind moved across the valley once more, rustling the cottonwood leaves as the riders looked at one another in uneasy silence. The silver of the Redstone Hills still waited somewhere beneath the earth, but the map that could lead them there was no longer something any one man could claim. Ethan tipped his hat once toward the girl beside him. She gave a small nod in return. Then, without another word, they turned their horses toward the open prairie and rode slowly into the wide, quiet darkness, while the men behind them continued staring at the undisturbed ground beneath the cottonwood tree.